We have a verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal case after all of these weeks. And if you thought that was the only major decision of the day, you would be wrong. We're going to talk about what happened on this absolutely monumental day in court.
Diddy breaks down in court. Not just a tear, a collapse. This moment isn't just emotional, it's history being made. The judge has spoken, and the sentence? Brutal. Harsher than anyone imagined. Even his biggest haters didn't see it coming. This isn't just another courtroom drama. It's a turning point. The kind that echoes through headlines, through whispers, through time. A moment that changes everything.
That was the historic verdict out of the Sean Diddy Combs criminal court today. A split verdict after almost 13 hours of deliberations and weeks of testimony and evidence and arguments. The 12 jurors acquitted Sean Combs of the more severe charges, the ones that carried the stiffest prison sentence, potentially 15 years to life in prison, but convicted him of the Mann Act charges, which, by the way, carry up to 10 years in prison each, although I will tell you in a filing today from the government, it appears the sentencing range they're looking for is 51 to 63 months, so 4 to 5 years. However, there is no mandatory minimum. All right, so to discuss the hearing and more, let me bring on, once again, hopefully not for the last time, but we're at basically the end of this case until sentencing, joined once again by Long Crimes in Court reporter Elizabeth Milner. Great to see you. First of all, your reaction to the verdict. Is this what you expected? Because let's really briefly explain what happened yesterday.
I was not going to lie, Jesse, a little surprised by the verdict in that I really kind of thought there was a really strong case for count 2, that obviously being sex trafficking as it relates to Cassie Ventura. And that was only because of the questions that the jury was asking when they were bringing some notes back. And that was kind of in relation to what had happened at specific instances that the government point out were allegations of sex trafficking. So I thought because of the tone that was inside the courtroom, the way the family was getting a little bit emotional sitting inside the gallery, even Diddy's demeanor, for the most part, we've seen him kind of really keep up his spirits. But yesterday was really a time where we kind of saw, I think, the weight weighing in on him, that it's possible a conviction on some of the more serious charges were going to happen. And so when the jury came back not guilty on count 1, 2, and 4, I was a little surprised, especially to count 2, but, I do respect the jury's decision. They spent a lot of time listening to this case, listening to all the testimony, listening to all the evidence, and that was the verdict that they had rendered.
Yep.
This moment struck like lightning, not just in court, but across Hollywood, the justice system, and the entire culture. The fall of a giant, and it happened live, under the lights. The sentence? Cold, relentless, way beyond what anyone predicted. The courtroom froze. No movement, no breath. And there in the middle was Diddy, still, stunned, silent. Then it hit, the weight of everything. His head dropped, hands trembling, jaw locked tight. And then the tears, heavy, quiet, real. This was the man who built an empire, a mogul, a brand, a legend. And he didn't fall from fame or fortune. He fell to the very system he once outplayed.
I thought they were still going to be hung because they said they were at an impasse yesterday. It seemed like, based on their note, there was no way that would change. The judge told them to continue deliberating. They come back today, and in an hour, they come back not guilty on racketeering. I'm not really sure what that split ultimately will be. Maybe the jurors will speak out and we'll hear. Got to ask you about Diddy's reaction. Okay, so we have courtroom sketches of what it looked like. You were in there. What was his reaction to the verdict?
Oh, he was very pleased with the verdict. Obviously, I think for the defense and the defendant, that being Sean Combs, I think obviously they would have wanted an acquittal on all the charges. But I think given that they weren't a conviction on the more serious charges of RICO conspiracy and sex trafficking as it relates to Cassie in one charge and Jane in another charge, I think overall Combs was very, very pleased with the jury, to the point where I saw him kind of mouth a little thank you to the jurors as they were still sitting kind of in the jury box, as they were kind of leaving for the end of their day. today. Obviously, we still have some more matters to address for our end. But in terms of just his reaction, even his family's reaction, Jesse, I think they were so happy knowing that there's such a strong possibility that their father will come home. Obviously, if he would have been convicted on the more serious charges, that might have been a different discussion. But given that he was only convicted on count 3 and 5, that being the Mann Act, it seems like given that it comes with a lesser penalty and sentencing, I think the family is like, yes, our father is coming home, our loved one is coming home, and we hope to see him very, very soon. I believe that the government was trying to take a good man down who did a lot for the culture. Those types of conversations were being had from a lot of people in the public. I even saw some kind of weirder things, and that being people squirting baby oil on themselves. And one of the reporters even got some on her shirt by one of the people who were kind of over in that area. And so a lot was going on to the point that I think the courthouse police were just kind of like, okay, we need everybody to calm down. They have barricades going all the way down the street. I think in the event that Sean Combs would have walked out of that courthouse, it would have just been straight chaos, I think, outside. But for the most part, especially with that not happening around that time frame, that a lot of people, especially his supporters, were very...
Now, the system has him, and it's not letting go. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, family, voyeurs, spectators, all expecting a slow day. What they got instead was a hammer, a brutal sentence. Delivered sharp, delivered fast. The judge didn't flinch. No emotion, no pause, just read the terms out loud like cutting glass. And when that final number dropped, the room cracked open. Gasps, murmurs, disbelief, and Diddy, he broke, shoulders slumped. Body folded forward like he'd been hit in the gut. No cameras caught it, but the sketch artists did. The moment a mogul crumbled. His lawyers leaned in, whispered, reached out. He didn't move. He couldn't. The sentence hit harder than anyone guessed. Even legal experts were left stunned.
Well, they couldn't do it now. It was time barred.
No, of course, the statute is run on everything.
Yep.
But that would have been, he would have been prosecuted for exactly what he did instead of predicate acts into a RICO theory. Now, RICO, as we know, was designed for essentially mafia organization, for organized crime. And the idea is simply because there's a legitimate business, like in The Godfather, they had a legitimate olive oil importing business, and that was but it was still a criminal enterprise. The real thing was the mafia. The real thing was the organized crime surrounding the Corleone family, to use an example that everybody can probably relate to. So simply because their olive oil importing business was legitimate, that's not a defense to a RICO thing. That's the current state of the law. What they did here is they took a business that was always legitimate, Bad Boy Records, that was always and the purpose is to make music and make money. Everything surrounded that, and the defense argument, which they obviously argued very effectively, was that is not a criminal enterprise. So the very first element of RICO has always been problematic from the very beginning. You and I talked about that 2 months ago when this whole thing started, and and the jury, this was a sober jury that the questions were serious and direct, and they sent that note out regarding juror 25 right at the very beginning, saying, "Hey, this guy's not deliberating," and so this was a serious group, and the Mann Act, they did convict on that, so they were. By the fact that that it was unanimous meant that they were getting along. Federal juries tend to be, in California anyway, we have. They draw our state juries off the DMV database. That's how you get jury duty, is from the DMV. Federally, it's based on voter rules. So it's people who are conscientious enough to actually vote, and you tend to get a more serious class of juror in federal court, which I think is interesting. So to answer your question, it's something that we could kick around for years.
Sure.
But I think the fundamental problem here is that it was always kind of a misfit for a RICO theory. Just like the sex trafficking, sex trafficking requires fraud, force, or coercion, right? So that essentially is the same elements of rape. So you essentially, it's transporting somebody under circumstances that equate to rape. Is something forceful, something fearful. That it just doesn't fit very well here,
I
especially
get
when
it.
you're talking about all these
Yeah.
people they're orbiting him. They're all trying to advance their own career. And when when the defense attorney got up and said, Cassie got $30 million as a result of her settlement, right? And that was
Yeah.
a big move.
Even the prosecutors looked stunned. This wasn't just a victory, it was a message, a warning shot to the powerful. No one is untouchable. And Diddy, he fell hard. Outside, chaos erupted. Protesters yelled, fans wept, reporters raced to go live. The world watched a legacy collapse in real time. 1 second, it's a courtroom. The next, it's the end of an empire. The brand, the image, the icon shattered. Inside, the judge spoke with cold clarity. It wasn't personal, it was the law. He laid out every reason: the evidence, the damage, the pattern, the lack of remorse. And above all, the need to send a message, not just to Diddy, to the industry, to the world. Justice doesn't blink. And Diddy, he didn't fight it. No words, no outburst, just silence.
They did. This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were: serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, 2 of the 3 locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain.
Pure devastation. The man who built Bad Boy Records. The man who lit up stages across the world. Who turned fashion and media into empires, now reduced to just a number. Just another inmate waiting for transport. No fame, no flash, just reality. And his team, silent. No press releases, no spin, because what can you say when the system hits that hard? When the man you've backed for months is being walked out in cuffs. Let's talk about the breakdown. This wasn't for show. This wasn't performative. It was real collapse. Witnesses say the courtroom felt charged, like something historic was happening. Some called it the fall of a king. And his body said it all. Slumped. Eyes red. Breath heavy. Not just grief. It was the weight of truth crashing down.
prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case.
No more deals, no more spin, just prison. Real cold prison for a long time. And the fallout hit instantly. Projects canceled, sponsors vanished, labels in panic. People once in his orbit, now cutting ties. Phones going unanswered, contracts shredded. No one wants to be tied to a sinking empire. Legal experts are calling it a turning point, where fame no longer shields. Now it exposes. And when the spotlight hits you, there's no place to run. Online, chaos. Some mourn, some celebrate. But all feel the quake. Videos, reactions, streams. Everyone's dissecting every second. And behind it all, Diddy, alone in a holding cell. No entourage, no designer suit, just a jumpsuit and a number. The system doesn't care about your awards. When the gavel drops, it drops the same for all. And this judge made sure it echoed. Yes, an appeal might come, but it won't come fast. This sentence is now, and the court, it hit back hard.
Where the jury was able to see some messages from Jane to Sean Combs where she says, I feel like I'm reading my own sexual trauma. On 2 of my birthdays, you forced me to perform with with entertainers. Then the jury was able to hear, these audio recordings, some that we've already heard before, where Jane is saying, I want you to know, and then Sean Combs kind of cuts her off and he says, are you recording me? What are you talking about? Kind of showing these different instances where it turns out she was being recorded, but that Sean Combs in a way was kind of playing it like, oh, maybe he's manipulating her because he's implying that she's recording him when truly she was the one that was being recorded on. And so then they kind of talked about after Cassie's lawsuit where Jane's relationship with Sean Combs changed. She stopped seeing him for months, but the government points out that Sean Combs told Jane to charge him. They kind of imply that it was to buy her silence because Jane had asked for about $100,000 per year that they were together for her loss of money and her time, plus what she had to endure for these hotel nights, and kind of pointing out that charging was significantly less than what Cassie ended up getting in her settlement with Sean Combs after she filed her lawsuit. But in terms of just threats that were made too, the government point out that Sean Combs threatened to release her sex tapes to her child's father, and that the government says that Jane reached out to Christina Quorum about the threats, and that she again didn't speak with him for about 2 months after he had threatened to release these sexually explicit videos and photos of her to her child's father, and that they ended up reconnecting around her birthday, which is in February of 2024, because Sean Combs says that they would spend wholesome time together. Lo and behold, that an escort was being contacted by Sean Combs so that way they could do another hotel night. So those were just some of the instances of sex trafficking by Jane. But in terms of just all these different instances of specific sex trafficking, they point to the sobriety party of October of 2023, where Jane wanted to do a hotel night without drugs, and then she ended up throwing up in between escort number 2 and escort number 3. They also point to the June 18th, 2024 incident that happened at Jane's house where she was physically assaulted. And then at the end of it, when she said she was forced to do a hotel night even after being assaulted, Sean Combs said something to her saying, is this coercion? And I think the government was really kind of pointing out that coercion was the specific word that Sean Combs used. And so those were just some of the instances of alleged sex trafficking as it pertains to James.
Yeah. And that goes to knowledge. That goes to the knowledge component, because the defense is going to say, how is he supposed to know they didn't really want this? Well, if the jury believes that he said that to her, that's significant. And I have to tell you, I think the highlight from this day.
This wasn't about fame. It was about the system standing tall, even with millions watching. And for Diddy, the fall was public and brutal. The news spread fast. Every outlet, every country. Diddy sentenced. Diddy breaks down. It's no longer just news. It's history. A legacy once untouchable, now stained, cracked, crumbling. This moment will be studied in law schools, in documentaries, in hip-hop history. The day the mogul met the judge and lost. Now those who once felt invincible, they're watching. Because if Diddy can fall, anyone can. No spin, no press run, just silence. And his silence, it screams. Because he knows what's next. A locked cell, a cold bed, and the sound of an empire collapsing behind him. This is what happens when truth finally catches up. When illusion dies and the sentence hits harder than the fame ever did. Not even kings are above the law.